Welcome to the Truth Has No Sides podcast. These conversations will be had to expand the minds and the consciousness of you, the listener. If you like the content of the show, please like the video and subscribe to our channel to help this message be seen and heard by more people. Thank you for being here and enjoy the episode.
All right, session 2 with David Buckland. We talked about so many topics in the first one that we could have branched off for hours. I know you've got a website full of blog posts. You are an endless supply of basically a PhD level of awakening of consciousness of so many things. The one thing that really caught me though, because nowadays psychedelics are such a big thing and they're doing great things for a lot of people, but you hinted at some of the other side of psychedelics. And then you also mentioned that you started formally researching trauma. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I know wherever I leave it, you're going to expand on it. So I'd love to let's talk about exactly what we were talking about right before we started this recording and where you want to start. So just start and we'll just flow from there.
It's useful, I think, to start with a broader perspective. Ayurveda tells us that there's two kind of fundamental processes in spiritual development: Atman and Sattva. Atman is basically consciousness, awareness, presence. There's different ways and ways of experiencing relating with that, but it's fundamentally that process of consciousness waking up to itself within, and then within the world, and then transcending consciousness into Brahman, that kind of unfolding process that we touched on somewhat in the last journey. So it's that part of it is a journey in consciousness. The other half of the process is Sattva, which just means purity or clarity. It's essential. It's a fundamental quality of the world and of our physiology. And I think I mentioned in our previous conversation about the three gunas and how when tamas is dominant, we experience the world as solid and real. When tamas is like inertia, essentially, a very physical version of all things. And when rajas, or fire or transformation, becomes dominant, then we experience the world as an illusion. And then finally, when sattva becomes dominant, we experience the world as lila, the divine play. And sometimes people talk about awakening in that context, that it becomes the divine play, but it's actually a separate process, the awakening consciousness and the process development of sattva. Now, consciousness and sattva are cumulative through lifetimes. So our spiritual development from prior lives kicks in this life at some point. Usually there's some karma and stuff sort out early on, but as we move into adulthood, that's when our teenager adulthood range is often when the seeker kicks in and we start looking for spiritual development, or maybe later too, or sometimes even earlier. But if we want to support that spiritual development, there's those two parts of it. And so practices that support development of sattva and development of consciousness are very beneficial. Now, if there's more consciousness development and not so much sattva, then you get descriptions that are more like an awakening into no self and emptiness. Whereas if there's more sattva developed, it's more development into fullness and the cosmic self. And the difference there is simply the degree of clarity of consciousness, whether we experience the space of consciousness as empty or full is the clarity in that. So of course clarity and consciousness are closely intertwined, but they're still somewhat separate processes. And then if you get someone who has a lot of clarity, but not so much refinement of perception and so on, and not so much consciousness, then you get people with lots of fancy experiences, but not so much grounding. They don't have that stable inner core of awake consciousness. And so their experiences tend to pull them around. Now, so then what we want is practices that culture those two things. For example, I recommend an effortless mantra meditation to help with the purify the physiology and have that experience of transcendence or samadhi. And samadhi creates yoga, or essentially that inner union, that direct experience of our true nature, our inner self, that pure consciousness. And touching into pure consciousness also has this interesting benefit, is it can trigger, when there's enough clarity in the physiology, it can trigger the production of what's called soma. It's also called amrita, or nectar. And essentially at a very refined level, one of the sheaths, you might say, of the divine is what the Vedas have described as an ocean of milk, a white ocean. And it's essentially like this ocean of raw soma. But that raw soma is not a nectar that's consumable. It has to be refined, it has to be processed. And you see a lot of interpretation of this, that soma is something you do manually in a performance, and you grind a special flour that's extremely rare and drink the juice of it, blah, blah. And there's also, I've seen academic texts describing soma as a magic mushroom, hallucinogenic, and the Vedas are all, drug trips, basically. That's not a good understanding. In actual fact, it's the human physiology that is the filter. And when we transcend and touch into that source, there's a point inside the head where some of that raw soma leaks in and comes down. It's filtered by the physiology. It drips in the back of the throat. You sometimes get a sweet taste in the mouth, and then it's swallowed into the digestion, where it's distributed out amongst the body. Now, this isn't a physical substance. It's kind of pre-physical, close to physical, but not quite physical. But that substance really helps refine the physiology, to help with refined perception and the awakening heart, and that refined part of the process. And it also helps with what I would refer to as nature support. Is essentially the ability of, it enhances the abilities of the laws of nature that make up our physiology, and allows us to be more effective and do more effectively. Now, one of the things that's happened with me, and on the purification side, the clarity side, is we're kind of built up in layers. We have our surface physical body, then we have our emotional body, we have our mental body, and then there's the intellect and heart layer behind that, or actually around that. They get progressively bigger. And then what's known as the bliss body, or the causal, and so on. But these are the relevant ones. And so when I'm talking about sattva, it's not about like maintaining a perfectly pure diet, because that's just on the physical level. But it's all these other levels. If you're kind of maintain, pure thinking and a pure diet with control, then you might be creating some purity on the surface, but on the energetic level, that control is actually tamasic, or rajas, or it's either creating inertia or fire. It's burning it, and that it's not actually creating purity. So it's like this process of more letting go. And what I found in my own journey is that I got kind of pushed as this kind of spiritual development came along. I got kind of these nudges to look at healing on another level. Now, gradually, I did a lot of work through meditation, a lot of purification, and then I took up some energy healing practices, working with healers and on my own, on myself. And then at a certain point, I realized that some of this stuff wasn't able to fully embody in the physical because there were still impressions of trauma. Now, when I use the word trauma, a lot of people think, oh, an assault or car accident or something, an acute, sudden trauma. But actually, any experience we've had in our life that created overwhelm, or we weren't able to fully process the experience, we kind of put it aside to process it later when we have more capacity. But what often happens is instead we suppress that unfinished experience. And it creates what is effectively karma, because it's like an action that hasn't completed. So there's a seed of karma in there, and we suppress it in the physiology so that we can feel comfortable. It's like a coping mechanism, and it's the people around us are typically, that's what they do. And so they're suppressing that junk inside, and it creates two things, what are broadly called samskaras and vasanas. Samskaras are the impressions and habit patterns. So the ways we automatically respond in the future to a similar trigger. And the vasanas are essentially the reactivity, the tendency to over respond to a circumstance, or to have buttons that people can push, or circumstances that agitate us, or trigger our emotions in undue ways. And those are basically symptoms of unresolved trauma. And so, yes, recently I've been studying trauma because I realized that to fully embody, because you don't want to just wake up. You want to bring all that into the physiology, right into all through those layers I talked about, right onto the surface. You want to fully embody that awakening. That's where you get the richest benefits. And so what I got pushed into was studying about trauma and learning techniques for finding and healing that stuff. So the energy healing I had done really helped with those reactivity points and the vasana part, but it didn't really get into the somatic part, into the physical and the pre-physical kind of area there where the impressions are laid in. So I needed to get more, do more into the physical so that I could embody in the physical as well. And it's been quite an interesting journey. I'm learning about the types of trauma and the way we stored it, and how the coping mechanisms work. I had studied about stress back in the 70s and the current understanding about fight and flight and so on like that. But the understanding of that has evolved quite a bit. Now there's fight, flight, fawn, and freeze responses. And you can see examples of them in animals as well. And those are natural responses to stress. But if our natural responses are being suppressed to some degree, like for many of us, we were told as kids that it wasn't safe to be angry. We got angry and frustrated about something. Our parents often didn't know healthy ways of expression, so they didn't teach them to us. And so we didn't learn to express anger in healthy ways. And so oftentimes we suppressed it. But that unresolved anger is still sitting in there. It didn't go away. And so we're habitually suppressing it. And there's a tendency for a lot of people as they're growing up and through their teen years to get more angry about their circumstances. But again, if there's that habit of suppressing it, then they just pack it away inside. And it burbles up here and there. But it's surprising how much of this stuff we can carry and not be aware of it. So yeah, there's this kind of idea that awakening means that we're free of stress and we have no more of this kind of stuff. But awakening doesn't, it happens in the self, it happens in consciousness. We remain the same person. We don't suddenly become perfect and pure that's a process. It takes time to clean up, and we have to be actively engaging it. If instead we're more about trying to keep things the same, and there's parts of us that are resisting seeing this stuff because that's been our habit often for decades, then that stuff's going to still be in there. And what's going to happen, someone is going to go along, and you see this with spiritual teachers, for example. They're going along and thinking themselves, speakers of truth and all this stuff, and then they get triggered and act out their traumas on their students. But because it's subconscious, they don't really recognize the dynamics. You're going to have to need a little bit of understanding to see the dynamics in play. And then it becomes quite obvious, actually. And then end up creating problems in spiritual communities. And it's a lot more common than I realized. You're muted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Something that's very big right now is conscious work. So as you were just speaking, that's the thing that brought to my mind. You were talking about it's in the subconscious for a very enlightened individual. They still act out their karma. They may take advantage of their students. It's more common than you noticed. A lot of the subconscious work is being shown as watching or listening to things as people fall asleep, listening to a different story, a new recording as they're sleeping. I assume that's not something that is what you would suggest. If it's subconscious in an individual, what is the best way to work with that, to work on it?
Well, it kind of depends on a number of factors. It depends on their broader state of our physiology. Like one of the first things we need to do is learn how to find a sense of calm or safety or security in ourselves. A lot of people will put that on other people, create codependent relationships. But if we could bring that back to ourselves, then we have a core place of stability. And that can be a place in our body or a foot or our heart or whatever, where we feel calm and we can come back to calm and safety. It may be an imaginal place, a memory of a place we've been, but just some way to come back to a calm state. Somebody who's been meditating for a long time is going to have more of that because they've done some of that work to clean house and have that, or they have a broader calm state. And once we have that stable platform, then we can learn to touch into our traumas, basically places where there's a burbling going on, a little reactivity or a sensitive point or a contraction, or there's a few ways. And also a little bit of education in there is really useful too, to understand the state of the nervous system we're running at. Because what often happens, we're in a stress response state for a lot of people all the time, or most of the time. And it's just kind of an automatic thing we go into when we go into work, or where we're in a social situations or whatever. And it's so automatic we don't even recognize that we're doing it. And so we automatically go into a defensive state, or if it's not safe to be angry, for example, we may go into a state of freeze. One good symptom of trauma is people who don't really feel anything. And being neutral with your feelings, neutral about feeling or having no real feelings, usually tells me that you're in some kind of shutdown, that your emotions are blocked off because you don't experience them as being safe or comfortable. And so there's kind of a relearning that needs to take place, where you learn about how to be comfortable and safe, and then how to touch into your emotional state. And then if you're further along, you move past that stuff and the reactivity part, then getting into the stuff underneath that. So once you're able to get out of the trauma state, then you're able to do the healing work. And let the old trauma surface and be seen and processed. And it's pretty fascinating stuff. I did a session recently where there was some old fear was burbling up. I cleared some anger, teenage anger, and it turned out to be covering some childhood fear. And when I went into the fear, it turned out to be covering some ancestral trauma. And that fear went back to a distant ancestor who had starved. And then that went back to a further ancestor where it was originally about regret. And then that went back to a still further ancestor where it was regret. And so it's kind of this unresolved energetic impression in an ancestor had been carried forward for generations into the present. And I was now able to resolve it. Now, when I talk about it like this, I'm not saying I'm going into and re-experiencing that trauma. What I'm doing is I'm creating a safe space and then allowing the energy of that trauma to be experienced. So that, and there can be emotional qualities to that, but it's not about stepping into the drama and reliving it and all that kind of stuff, because that can just re-traumatize us. It's about being able to go in and underneath it and then resolve the energetic core. So then it can rise up safely in a safe space and be gone. And then it's no longer passed down to your children and all that kind of stuff too. It's been a pretty fascinating study, and I've learned a lot.
Okay, so I assume many people listening would hear you talk about this ability to fill into a teenage trauma that was covering up some fear from childhood, and then to drop back into an ancestor, and then you talk about it like it's going to the grocery store and picking something up, right? It's in a very simple way. Well, I'm just saying for you, it's a very simple process. So, is this something that would take quite a bit of effort to get to that point? Do you need to be awakened? Do you need to go through what you've gone through in our last couple talks to be there, or is there nowadays everyone says they have a modality and they're teaching all of these new ways, and there's a million different options of do this and you get this. For you, is there anything that you could help people with to do this same thing?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes for some people, just being able to find some safety in themselves is their first step. They don't have that already. Whereas if you're meditating for a little while, you're going to have some of that basic stuff. And if you've been doing any kind of emotional awareness or energy healing work, that kind of stuff already, then a lot of that, the reactivity stuff will have been resolved. It's really helpful to have an observer or witness quality, so you can step back into presence and just observe this stuff coming up. And then it's you're a lot less likely to get caught up in it. You're just watching it. And you're curious about it. You're not trying to control anything. You're just curious about what's in there, and you take a look. Now, being awake does make it easier. I've certainly made more rapid progress post-awakening and been more effective, but it's not necessary to be awake to heal this stuff. It may take a little more time, but it may not. It depends on how comfortable you are and how used to allowing you already are. There's different people use different terms for it, but the ego has this habit of trying to control. It wants to keep everything in control, so it feels there's sort of a sense of safety in that, even though it's not any real safety, because it's quite an illusion. But it wants to try and keep things in control. So if that's not so strong, we've softened it through meditation or other practices, and then it can be easier as well. because the natural process is just to allow it to be there and to be as it is. Whereas if there's ego involved, it's in there trying to control, it wants to suppress this stuff. So that gets in the way of it being seen. But when we feel safe and we reassure the body that, this is real safety. And it's one of the things about the body that's quite interesting. The physical body is only in the now. It doesn't recognize past and future. That comes from the mind. And so on a somatic level, if we're experiencing the body because of past trauma, the body experiences that as right now. And that's why it sustains the trauma state, because that unresolved experience is experience that's still happening right now. And so part of that process is helping the body recognize that it's over, it's safe, and we can release this now. It's an interesting little dance. So yeah, but even not being awake, just a little practice, understanding the process, so we can do it effectively. I don't know a lot of the modalities really well. The one I'm studying with is through the Center for Healing in Australia. What they've done is studied a number of modalities, some of the more prominent ones, Peter Levine and IFS and so on like that, and taken the best there and synthesized them into a process they call embodied processing. And they have a whole systematic process that they use, you can use for yourself, or they have practitioners that are trained and all over the place. Mostly they offer online too, so you can go through the process with them. And it's very useful for a wide number of things, because we can have traumas that cause addictions, for example. We can have trauma that causes undesirable behavior, other kinds of undesirable behaviors. Trauma that just kind of creates a cloud or shadow over our life experience. And trauma that messes up relationships, causes us to tend to sabotage or feel unsafe in perfectly safe circumstances. And it's kind of a funny thing, because the ego has this thing where protecting itself is really important, and it triggers the physical body in trauma states that are designed to protect us in the event of a physical hazard, like seeing a tiger, and we need to act quickly and get out of there. But the ego behaves like an angry boss is a tiger, and because its identity is threatened in some way, and the trauma gets entangled with the identity, and then we start thinking that, I am a person who's easily scared. I am a person who has self-worth issues. I'm not a person who has much value in the world, or I don't have a real purpose. Those kinds of narratives that can develop from our trauma, and then they become entangled with the identity, and we think that's who we are, when it's just unresolved stuff. And a lot of it goes back to early childhood, just simple stuff. I grew up with a single mom, and with two siblings, and she was working full time, so she wasn't really very available. And there was no intentional thing on her side to neglect, but she wasn't particularly available. And so that had effects on my early childhood development in ways that I'm now recognizing in studying the topic. And so now that it's conscious, I can help clear that up. Whereas before, it was unconscious. And that's part of the spiritual process. And as I mentioned, there's those two sides. There's the development in consciousness and development in purity and clarity. And that purity and clarity includes doing, healing work. And that can include trauma and stress and just, certainly diet can have an impact, but it's relatively superficial compared to trauma, for example. Soma will have a much larger benefit than eating the perfectly prepared foods. I mean, certainly it's wonderful to eat high quality food, but how accessible is that for us where we're living and so on? It's not like we're never going to get enlightened if we can't eat pure organic or something like that. It's helpful, but it's there's these guys who live in the mountains and beg for food and eat somewhat randomly, and they become enlightened. Some of them, although some of that is also depends on how it's being done. Sometimes what you have is someone who finds themselves struggling in the world, and so they abandon the world to go off and focus on a spiritual quest, when their dharma is to be a householder, to be in the world, and to work through that karma they were experiencing and find healthier ways to deal with it. And so they end up not succeeding in either, because they're not here to be a monk, and they're not acting in the world the way they're supposed to, so their karma can't be fulfilled properly, and this creates problems. It's a lot of nuance in getting it right. We can be slow learners.
Yeah. It reminds me of Michael would talk to me, and he was talking about Maharishi, about how you need to deal with the root of the issue, not the leaves. So if someone is going to a healer and they are able to experience a certain level, like let's just say you, the anger, and then it was passed down to a childhood experience, but then you kept going back to generational. If the healer can't go back that far or can't see that clearly, are they really getting healed, or are they just putting a Band-Aid on it?
Okay, now the healer isn't the one that's doing that work. What the healer is doing is creating the space for that to happen in. And then basically you just follow the trail. I mean, when I've done a bunch of these practice sessions, students practice on each other, get to learn the techniques and so on. And I've done a bunch of these, and most of them aren't that involved, or don't have quite so many stages. It's not unusual to resolve one emotion and then find another one underneath it. It's a little less common to go back through generational stuff. Like in the previous session I did, that was when the anger surfaced, and I processed the anger. Right at the end of the session, I noticed that there was a nugget of fear underneath it. But we were finishing the session, and it wasn't time to deal with that. And then I tried to work on that myself, but it wasn't surfacing with me. And then in a guided session, then it surfaced, and then this whole other chain of stuff surfaced. So really, every session is different. Sometimes it's just one thing, and sometimes there's a whole chain of things. You never know what's going to take place, and they're not controlling what's taking place. They're just kind of guiding you into the space to allow what's there to surface. And then if you start to shift into getting traumatized by what's surfacing, then they guide you out of that back into a safe space again. And that's the role that they play. Their skill is in guiding you in through the process, but the process itself takes place in you. And so it just happened that last session I did happened to be quite interesting to me, because one of the things about it too is that when you're experiencing on that level, when you're experiencing the release of the energy, it has a quality of intelligence with it. And so the nature of what's being cleared comes up too. Like I didn't go into the ancestral life to see everything that happened, but I saw enough to know what it was about. And that there was a drought, and the father ended up starving to provide for his family. And then he had this grief afterwards as well, because he died, but he didn't know if they survived. But in the process of this experiencing, I recognized that they did survive, and so I could resolve that part of his trauma as well. And it's just kind of and it's not going into his life and experiencing, making this choice to support his family over himself, but to on the energetic level, dealing with it on that level, and getting these hints from it, and all. I mean, the entire process happened in about a half hour, so it's not like I was spending a whole lot of time in each thing. It was just a little bit of information, and then on to the next layer. So it's like really varies, and that's and I've done a bunch of those sessions, and I've done energy healing before that, and so it made it easy for that process to take place. Experiences vary, but the process, the point isn't sort of to have a series of ancestral lives recognized, but to resolve whatever it is, and whatever that needs. For me, going back in the ancestral lives had some value. For others, it doesn't. Like, I'm aware of a bunch of past lives as well, and that's often come up because of old garbage that was surfacing. And when I went into it, it came with an understanding of how it was created, and so I knowledge of that prior life. But there are I know lots of people who are awake who don't remember any past lives and don't want to. They have no interest in that. They don't need to go into their past lives to experience it. And you can experience the contraction now, or you can experience it in the past. It's really the same on one level. And so how it works for you and where you go with that, it doesn't matter. The key is just resolving.
Is this what Suzanne Stryker is seeing and working with? Is in a sense, for the people who come to her for her weekly or monthly distance healings, is that kind of the same thing she's doing?
It's a little different.
Okay.
What I've been studying is trauma focused. She works more on the level of energy healer. But the key with energy healers is they're working from source. That's where you get the root part. Because if you're working, I took a class once in energy healing, and basically what they had us do was run our hands a little above the surface of someone's body, and where we felt some shadow or resistance, pour energy into it. And that may have some benefit, but is that getting at the root? Is that actually helping anything, or just soothing it a little bit? Whereas people like Suzanne and Dorothy Rowe, Kristen Kirk, some of the people I know, they go into source and approach it from underneath, from the root. And so when you come up from the bottom, so to speak, and you see the source of the trauma or the stress or the karma, or however you want to relate to it, or whatever type of contraction it is, and you resolve it on that level, and then it's complete. The whole thing, if you uproot the weed from the roots, then the seeds and the whatever like that will wither. Whereas if you stomp on the weed but don't pull the weed out, it may grow back up again, as I've experienced.
Well, so I have a unique question for you, because you and I have crossed paths at Michael's. Michael, we've brought in Dorothy. I've talked to Suzanne many times. I've met Christina Donnell many times. So listening to you explain how Suzanne works makes perfect sense. That's exactly what she says. That's exactly what I've heard. I've done a lot with her. I've done a lot with other healers. And my question for you, since you see a lot, and it may not be possible right now, but I've done a lot with those women, and I know how powerful they are. I've seen the things they've done for other people. I've heard what they've done. I've seen what they've done. I've listened to the testimonials. I've had friends. I've done a lot with a lot of healers, and I still have. I don't feel like the root has been taken care of. Like I've always wondered over the many years that I don't know what I've missed along the way, because I hear so many people talk about this and it works for them. I know it works. I know what they're doing. But for me, there's.
I think that they're getting at the root of this or that, but there's a lot of roots. You know,
Mhm.
the seeds of the wheat. No, that's not a bad example. Never mind. But just think about it. You know, if you think about it in a broader perspective, and not everybody, experiences it this way, but from my perspective, this lifetime is the net result of I don't know how many past lives have come up through the process, and so there's baggage unresolved from prior lifetimes coming up, and then I've gotten this birth with a family, and there's Ayurveda talks, like, along with the Sattva and Atman I talked about at the beginning. It comes with the bloodline and the lines of your mother and your father, and they carry ancestral stuff down, and some of that's ancestral learning, and there's benefits in there, but some of it is ancestral trauma that they haven't resolved, and they pass it on energetically to their children, and by their energetic patterns and so forth. And so when we can learn to resolve it at its root, we're deep enough to be pre-time, essentially. And so it's essentially healed across the spectrum. And I've seen some releases that are like that, where it was clear that I wasn't just resolving it for myself, but I was resolving it for my children and for several ancestors back. There's even there's a saying in the Vedas that someone who has a Brahmin shift benefits the family. I think it's 7 or 8 generations forward and back. I don't think it's that exact. It'll vary by person and how thorough the shift is and so on. But yeah, it has a broad spread. But when you think of gazillions of lifetimes and gazillions of ancestors, I've had stuff that's shown up from thousands of years ago, and it's been carried through all these generations and that. And sometimes there's even crossovers between my ancestral line and my past lives, and it's like this massive stuff that we end up with. And so it takes time to get at all that stuff. And I have the ability to look inside my body, and I can kind of go in and look and say, oh, well, this area is all clear. There's no more shadows there. But there's this little magic thing called nested spaces. I didn't understand this earlier on, but essentially there's spaces within spaces. And without going into a long explanation about that, essentially the physiology learns that to keep things out of our awareness, it can put things into a separate space and store them away. And if it also takes that space and puts it onto a different energetic level that isn't designed to process that type of information, like taking emotional baggage and sticking it on the physical level, then it's even more hidden. And so it's a coping mechanism. It's a perfectly natural thing for it to do. But if we want a really solid embodiment and clear experience and quality of life, then it's really valuable to do this kind of work. And we're undoing some of the hiccups of thousands of years, and it's fine. It's amazing the progress we can make. I find it funny in some ways because people have this expectation that they can wake up and be perfect in a few years, when they've been loading things on for thousands. One of the things was Maharishi said back in the early days of the teaching was that cosmic consciousness or self-realization would take 5 to 7 years. And a lot of people thought that was wonderful, but got kind of disappointed when it didn't happen. In fact, it happened for very few people in that kind of time frame. But I learned later that there's this cultural difference. In the West, we expect people like that to be speaking in facts, whereas in places like India, they speak intentionally. He speaks in terms of goals. And he used to do that every year. He would have he would go into silence for a while, and then come out, and there would be a celebration on January 12th, and there would be an announcement of the new year, and what they were trying, and it was all intentional, what they wanted to see. And I laugh when I think back now. If he had told us it would take 40 years, would we have actually followed him? But of course, it doesn't take 40 years anymore. This is for my generation. It took a while, but people now are waking up much faster, and people that have majorly traumatized their physiologies are waking up too, which I didn't think was possible at one time. So it's pretty amazing to see, like some people did hard drugs for an extended period of time, that can really mess up physiology. But it turns out it's not a barrier to meditation. Although in such a case like that, it's really helpful if you do some trauma therapy and resolve some of that. By trauma therapy, I'm not talking about talk therapy. It has its role, CBT and stuff has its role in certain kinds of things, like culturing that initial safety and so on if it's not there. But to actually get at the trauma, it's energetic. You don't get at it through talk. Is the mind. And the mind is actually what's trying to control and suppress it. So to actually heal emotional content, energetic content, you have to shift into that mode and be in an allowing state. It requires a different approach for actual healing. And that's one of the reasons why you see people in talk therapy for years and decades, because it's not really getting at the root. It can be very helpful on one level, but it's not actually getting at the source. It has its role, but to actually get to, once the ground is repaired, then you need to go deeper to get at the those somatic impressions and figures and stuff.
Why would you say people are waking up quicker? Why are they having an I hate to say easier time, because some of them are going through some very traumatic stuff to wake up, but is it just a shift of consciousness on this planet?
Yeah,
veil.
Because basically what happens is there's the more people wake, because consciousness is collective. So the more people that wake up, the more awake consciousness is as a whole. And so it lifts all boats. And so that makes it easier to awaken. However, it does create this other effect where people who are not on a spiritual path, who are not doing, healing work or working on themselves, they're just out there in the world, their consciousness is being pushed up too. And one of the things of being, as you become more conscious, you also become more conscious of your junk and the stuff that's unresolved. And so what's happening is it's pushing this stuff to the surface. And with people who don't have any skills with this, don't understand what's going on. And so instead, they become more reactive. And so you see this whole thing playing out in the collective, where there's this big wave of awakening, and then there's this big wave of purification that comes after that. And there's a bit of, crazy making and a lot of fear and upset. It's not very rational. But it kind of, the mind doesn't like to have emotions on an abstract basis, as Maharishi used to say. In other words, it doesn't like to have emotions for no reason. And so when it's feeling this stuff, it looks for things to blame. it looks to create a narrative. And so we blame our parents, or we blame the government, or we blame, the whole COVID thing, or whatever. And people get into crazy, convoluted narratives about how things are going, and all the conspiracy stuff. But so much of it is driven by fear, and I even see some awake people getting caught up in this stuff. But there's a fundamental principle that what you put your attention on grows stronger. So we don't deny if we're feeling angry or fearful or something like that, but we don't feed it by churning it. We try and shift our attention to more positive things, and to look at the benefits we have. The average poor person in North America is in the top 10% of global wealth. And we have access to, the internet is astonishing, what it's capable of. I don't know, have you ever watched any of those Tony Siva talks, where he talks about technology disruption? He's a researcher, has an organization that researches technology, and there's all this technology that's where you get a confluence of new technology that's cheaper than the old technology. He gives the example, for example, of New York at the turn of the 1900s. Picture of New York. There's one car, and all the rest is horses. About 10 years later, a little over 10 years later, it's all cars and one horse. This confluence of technology came together, and the automotive revolution began, and it transformed the way we design cities, the way we travel, what we do for holidays, how we work. Huge, massive transformations. And what he's pointing out is that at the moment we're on the verge of massive transformation in transportation. The dawn of the electric car and self-driving cars, basically meaning that within a relatively short period of time, owning a car will be irrelevant. It'll be cheaper to just call up a car on your app. It'll drive over, pick you up, take where you want to go. It does all the driving. It's now solar and wind are now cheaper than coal, and so essentially all new energy projects in the world are now solar and wind. And some countries like Germany are putting a massive effort into transitioning off coal, and this is happening all over the place. Like there's smaller countries where they've entirely replaced coal or natural gas burning with solar power generation, and even in food production is already transitioning into new technologies and stuff, and so on. So it's like a whole bunch of existing technology is going to become obsolete within less than 10 years. And he's been making these predictions for about a decade now, and they're usually accurate, even if they sound a little crazy. And a whole bunch of jobs now are going to disappear. Power generation is going to decentralize. The whole bunch of land that's currently used for cows, livestock is going to go back to nature, basically. And the whole issue with global warming and carbon is going to reverse. I can't remember how long he said, but in a relatively short period of time, we're going to start. We're going to flip the trends, just with this transition going on. Electric cars are now outselling gas cars in some parts of the world. I mean, this is already going on. So it's like people are kind of thinking that things are going down the toilet, but in actual fact, the production of energy is the ability to do work. Buckminster Fuller talked about this in his book Critical Path, where essentially when the cost of electricity becomes marginal, the ability to get work done becomes much cheaper. And so this kind of period of freedom and affluence is highly potential. But it's not obvious yet. It's still happening in the background and in some ways under people's noses, but it's because there's this transformation taking place where the more people that wake up, the higher consciousness it is, until you reach a point where there's enough people that are awake that the whole population experiences as if awake, even if they're not. They're raised to that level, and they're supported by the collective. And that changes everything.
That would absolutely change everything. I remember talking about how the nervous system of people needed to be refined. That's why meditation was so big. I remember them talking about that if taking everyone from first grade and putting them into high school would kind of fry their nervous systems. So you're saying that they will still be supported by the collective and experience life in an awakened state, but are they going to go from elementary to high school to college? That type, just in a linear.
Yeah, it's not one of the reasons it's not happening all at once is because people need the time to go through this process. And for some people, it's going to be a bumpy ride because they're not engaging it. And in fact, some people are actively resisting it. But if we understand that this is what's taking place and we engage it and support it in however way we can, then the process becomes much smoother, and we instead have this wonderful growth going on. So yeah, it's going to be a process, but it's reached a point now where it's kind of like inevitable is the wrong word, but there's a momentum. But see, there's an art going on here too. Like, we don't wake up from meditating. We don't wake up from any spiritual practices. We wake up when the self itself in consciousness wakes up to itself. It's like David never wakes up. We wake up from David and become universal consciousness, experienced through this body-mind. So what causes awakening is essentially the divine. And so the divine is kind of managing this so that this process takes place and it's gradually accelerating, but it's happening in as smooth a way as possible. Yeah, Margie used to talk about back in the early 70s that there was this possibility for a golden age to come, but he wasn't sure if we were going to pull it off. And enough people learned to meditate and transcend that the momentum began. And so he announced, I think it was in 1975, that it was coming. We were in the dawn. Of course, most people didn't see that. But there was a build-up, and then around 2006 to 2008 period, there was a whole whack of people woke up. People had been meditating. A lot of them were people who had been meditating for a long time. And it kind of hit that balance point. And then we started having more craziness in the world on the surface because of the purification that started. But I've just been amazed to watch the awakening that's taking place now. People who, they're not like a lot of people that woke up first were people who've been meditating for decades. So they're old people, right? But the people that are waking up now are half my age or younger. They have their whole life ahead of them in an awakened state. The development that can happen, because when you're awake, that the process goes faster, and the development and the refinement of what they can do. I have no idea. Where are you? I guess you could look at books like the Yoga Sutra. I mean, they talk about special abilities that can develop with consciousness in there, but different people have these different skill sets, and so you see people like Dorothy and Suzanne who develop these powerful healing techniques where I'm studying this stuff, but I'm not naturally a healer. I can do it on myself. I can write about it and share my understanding. That's more my dharma, from what I understand, anyways. Who knows whether that's going to change? But there's that process, and different people develop different skill sets. And some of the people, like I know a couple of people who they can look at somebody's energy and they can see not only the what we call the aura or the energy and the chakras, but they also see the astrological chart, their birth chart overlaid on that, and their DNA overlaid on that, all intertwined, and how they're all interrelating. I have no idea how that works, but it's pretty amazing what people can do.
So when you talk about these people who can see that clearly, they can see the DNA. How are they helping people? I assume they're healing.
Well, when they can see those dynamics, it means they can heal those. They can see how the astrological influence is creating a health influence or whatever, or might be creating a block, because the astrological chart is essentially a map of karma. It can show a tendency to awaken or to be spiritual, but it's mainly a map of karma. It's very difficult to predict when someone's going to awaken from somebody's chart, for example, because awakening is not a karmic thing. Again, it's comes from on high. It's the collective that's waking up to itself. So it's and it just varies, and also, of course, someone who's a healer like that, they're putting the attention on this all the time, and they're experiencing it in different people and how the different combinations work, and I know a fellow who's a Jyotishi, does Vedic astrology, and he used to do it for Amma in India. So he's done thousands of charts. So he can just take a glance at a chart and see all this information right away, just from that experience. And there's sort of equivalents in energy healers and so on. But it depends on their expertise and the levels that they operate on. Different ones are different. I mentioned Kristen Kirk, for example. She mainly does group work. She got saturated with demand and couldn't help as many people by doing one at a time, and so she does mainly collective stuff. Other people have stayed with individual sessions. Dorothy does both group and individual, and I think Suzanne too. Yeah, I've got a beautiful. Suzanne did a tapestry. I just love. I got from her.
The ability to see DNA is new. Is that person available to people watching to do calls with?
Yeah. That's Kristen.
Okay.
I don't know how she uses that in a healing context. But she's pretty interesting because, the first time she did a little demo session at one of the Science and Non-Duality conferences I was at, and there was a small group of us in a room. And, I'm kind of energy aware, and so when a healer works on me, I have a sense of where they're working because I can feel their attention in the body. Kristen starts, and all the chakras light up, the whole thing, which is all because the chakras, basically each chakra is related to a different level and the functioning of that level within our physiology. So there's 7 koshas or 7 layers, and then there's the 7 chakras, and the ground those layers in our physiology. Even our body isn't built of 7 layers, but it can bring all those layers into the body. And so having all the chakras light up at once was pretty astonishing, because she herself works with a team, and each members of the team specialize in different parts of it, and so on. I don't exactly know how her process works. She just makes comments here and there about what she's doing. And lately I've been Eva Mueller in Austria. She has a weekly free Zoom session where she does healings. At the moment, she's taking pregnancy leave. She just gave birth to a baby girl. Boy, what a powerhouse that kid is! Just like being born to someone who's awake and going through your entire natal period and with someone who's doing powerful energy healings. So, holy cow! It's
going to be something else when he grows up.
Yeah. So she said that towards the end of her pregnancy that her daughter was helping her before she was even born. Just like, holy God.
And that, I assume, is part of what these teachers are talking about, the next generation being so powerful.
Oh, yeah. I mean, some of these kids, there's a friend of mine in New York, and they've got a young daughter. And she's like, her eyes, it's like the Buddha looking back at you. Yeah, it's just amazing.
So for everyone thinking the planet's going down the toilet, as you put it, that this is just part of the process, as Maharishi used to say, before creation comes destruction.
Yeah, but it's like the falling away of the old so the new can come in. Same thing happens when you wake up. The falling away of the prominence of the ego and the rising of the self. And sometimes that can be a little bumpy for some people, but it's nothing to fear. It's just a transformation process. And if you understand what's going on, you can support it and not get in the way of the process. There's a book that was popular back in the day called Collision with the Infinite. This woman, she woke up and she knew about it, but she couldn't believe she had woken up. And so she fought it for 10 years. She went to psychologists and stuff and tried to get them to pathologize her experience and finally accepted it. And then she moved quite quickly after that. But, it's so unnecessary. I mean, people have their karma, but still, just it really helps if you understand what's going on. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote my book, is to help. One of the main reasons is to help people going through the process, because if you understand what's going on, you can support it. Whereas if you don't, it can be more of a struggle. You figured it out, but it can be much more of a struggle. And sometimes people wake up in ways that their tradition doesn't describe. Like the tradition says, oh, you're going to awaken into no self-nothingness. And then they wake up into cosmic self-fullness. And, oh, there's something wrong here. Or their tradition says, there's self-realization. This is the climax of evolution. And then the self-realization starts to fall away into God consciousness or unity. And they're like, what the heck's going on? I'm losing my enlightenment. When actually, no, you're progressing. And that's the thing. We're in a rising cycle, a very powerful rising cycle that's faster than usual for various reasons. And so there's this opportunity to ride this wave. And some people are of the opinion this is why the world population is so high at the moment, because as many souls as possible want to be born to be here for the transition, because you can make such rapid evolution during this transitional time. Not always easy, but certainly certainly rapid. And it's really worth it. That's the thing. There can be, bumpy spots. None of us want to go back into the old fear and junk that we're carrying around or deal with our karma particularly. But if we understand what's going on and just support it. It doesn't mean we have to kind of do all the shoveling, but just allowing the processing to take place, because the body and the emotional body and the mental body, it knows how to do all this stuff. It's just when the ego's in there trying to control it and make it happen a certain way that it can get in the way of the process. Where if we can reassure it, recognize this is a natural process and support it where we can, then it just is so much more simple, so much smoother. And then the quality of life we get out the other side is that enlightenment isn't the goal in itself. Awakening isn't the goal in itself. It's just a platform for living life that happens after that. And when we're on a platform for living life, like when we're in the ego self, we're kind of living in the lower three chakras, the mind, the emotions, the body. But when we wake up, we shift more into all seven, but primarily the upper three become much more prominent. Crown, the third eye, throat. And that's essentially associates with Satchitananda and absolute bliss consciousness. The absolute, the consciousness, and then the bliss body, which is the causal or bliss body I mentioned earlier. And those just become a living part of our day. And of course, it's not we're still human. We're still having our days where we're exhausted or tired or angry about something and that. But when we learn how to be with ourselves and how to experience emotions in healthy ways, then the anger comes up in a wave, and the wave is down, and it's complete. It's done. Nothing residual there. Nothing's going to create a big, nervous system trauma state. We just move through it, and we're done. And just those, just really simple life principles that we kind of missed in our culture. Our parents didn't know, so we didn't get it. Our friends didn't know. Our schools teachers didn't know. Usually, occasionally, you get somebody who gets somebody interesting in their life that helps them this way. But in general, we didn't get this stuff, so we kind of have to work on it ourselves and develop our own process, what works for us, and what supports our journey. Because each of us are a little different that way. Some people are more devotional, they're more heart-centered. Some people have a strong intellect, and so they get into this little dance of allowing the mind and intellect to be there, but not taking them quite so seriously. And then when the awakening happens, then the intellect shifts from associating with the mind and being pulled around all over where the mind's going, and becomes associated with consciousness, with the self. And then it becomes what's called resolute, becomes much more stable, much more refined, and it's able to discriminate much more clearly. And then that becomes the key platform for the unity shift, because the unity shift is a kind of an intellect, subtle intellect recognition, where we went before the intellect was out there looking out and dividing. Oh, this is this and this is that. This is this and this is that. This is this and this is that. It shifts into uniting. Oh, that is the self, and that is the self, and that is the self. And everything is recognized as the self, and it's gradually, as the Brahma Sutra described, it's gradually all integrated into the aggregate, into the whole, into the one. Yeah, the human journey is an amazing process, and we're really lucky to be living in a time where we're in this rising cycle and able to jump on what would we call it? It's not a Ferris wheel. Yeah, because the carnival rides go in circles. That's not what we're doing. Well, maybe in a spiral circle. But, yeah, I don't know a good analogy for this. Yeah, it's
Well, we were going to start this with the talk of trauma and psychedelics. I don't know how we haven't talked about that once, and we're an hour and 15 minutes in. So this is
but
a let's
yeah,
let's I don't know. Part of me wants to just shut this off right here because this is another good PhD level of awakening and healing and consciousness, and do another one about psychedelics. Um, would you agree with that, or would you like to touch on psychedelics and their ability to heal or not heal, or the trauma or increasing trauma to the nervous system?
yeah, psychedelics are having kind of a resurgence. One of the hazards of the spiritual path is sometimes people can get caught up in the idea that enlightenment is an experience. So I'll get enlightened through having some kind of experience, and so you can get into kind of chasing experiences, and so you get people who are kind of, you go to satsangs and people are asked to talk about their experience, and then people get jealous because someone had the experience and I didn't, and all this kind of thing. Um, but and sometimes even people can wake up and have a flashier awakening where they have a bunch of experiences along with the awakening, and then they can confuse the experiences with the awakening. But they were a side effect. The actual experience is that shift in consciousness within. And if you confuse the two, you can, again, even post-awakening, you can get into experience chasing. And seeking experiences is what often leads people into uh, psychedelics, thinking that psychedelics are a way to enlightenment. Now, I do know one person who woke up on a trip, but her awakening was so foggy that she didn't know she was awake for 10 years until all that cleared, or enough of it cleared. Because the problem with psychedelics is they give really strong experiences. They're distorted as well. And so it can traumatize our energy physiology. And so I talked before about culturing purity or clarity. Drugs do the opposite. And there's a tendency to need more and more to get the same thing because the nervous system gets traumatized or fogged, and then you need more to gain the same. I know several people whose lives were completely messed up by a bad trip, and the more modern issue of the plant medicine journeys is that those are even more traumatic. It's normal for people to barf all over the place in part of that process. So you know, I've not explored anybody energetically who's gone through that process, but I imagine it's lays its groundwork. And now there's people doing microdosing and that where you just take a little bit, but really what like Rick Archer talks about a little bit in his history. He did some LSD back in the day, but he realized that he wanted to be able to sustain it, and he wasn't going to be able to sustain it with drugs. The path is through a meditation practice, and that's when he took up meditation and putting aside those kind of things that are going to mess up your clarity, and instead focusing on clearing the path so that this can be a living experience and not just a passing drug trip. And that would, that's definitely my recommendation. That's not a path for spiritual development. Now, there is, a developing science around using it to break through serious trauma. The stuff I've been studying looks like it's capable of that. Couple of my teachers used to run a drug addiction, a medical clinic that specialized in healing drug addictions, amongst other things, but that was one of their specialties. And they helped a lot of people get off drugs through healing trauma. And because that's where the motivation for addictions tends to come from trying to escape from how we feel, trying to escape from our residual karma. So I can see where there may be a role in those kind of things, but from what I've seen, taking a trauma healing approach is superior. And it's safer, because it's kind of like drugs are like playing with fire. You might get some good trips, but, you may equally have traumatic bad ones. And, spiritual teachers I've had have always said, stay away from drugs, because they're a distortion. They're not the path to truth. So, I'm not a big fan.
My teachers have been as well. And I listened for about a decade, and then I needed to experience them myself. I never saw anything come from them. Mushrooms made me realize that that's how I was on a typical Tuesday with the conversations I was having. I was already a deep person asking about consciousness, and so there was no shift in consciousness there. It was just another experience. And the more aggressive ones, I never came out of them feeling better or like a release happened. And the microdosing, I didn't really experience much. So it was definitely not my path, but I've heard great things from a lot of people. The things they talk about are immediate in their response, immediate in letting something go. I wonder how that will be long term for them, if it needs to be something they need to continuously do. But yeah, like you said, it's coming back into the mainstream a lot. A lot more people are jumping on the bandwagon. I hope it helps them, but
but it's
also good to know the other side.
Yeah, from a spiritual standpoint, I think programs like what I'm studying with the Center for Healing would be much more effective, because you're not loading up the energy physiology in the process. You're clearing the trauma. There's other ways to get to it, basically, and people aren't as familiar. And I don't know, I'm not going to say that that's the answer for everybody. I don't know, but I'm just going to say that, in general, that you want to take care of your body. It's like it's quite common in spiritual circles to view the body as a temple, and our spiritual process is a kind of experiment to find out what works for us. But you have to be careful what you experiment with, whether it's going to be helping you long term or not. And from what I've seen, that's not a path that's going to be productive long term.
Could you? We'll wrap this up. It's been about an hour and 25 minutes. Could you tell people listening what that center is? The center that you're working with for healing and trauma?
Yeah, the Center for Healing. And they have some free courses you can take to get a sense of it. Like I took a free trauma-informed coaching class because I do spiritual coaching, and I thought that would be useful. But I found it so fascinating, I wanted to learn more. And so then I took the embodied processing program. And it's much more involved, and it's basically designed to train practitioners. But some people like myself take it to for understanding and education, and for my own self work. And we'll see where it goes. I mean, there's a possibility I could integrate it into my coaching, but it's not clear how I would do that.
Okay.
At this point.
Okay.
But we'll see. I mean, I didn't expect to be studying trauma a few months ago, so life takes me in places I don't expect sometimes.
what's a good place for people to find you? Like you said, you were doing some spiritual coaching.
Okay, well, I've got a website, davidya.ca. That's davidya.ca. And you'll see I've got a book on the stages of enlightenment there. There's well over 2,000 articles on a wide range of spiritually related or spiritually oriented topics about living life and the various transformations, the various stages. Some of it's quite advanced and some of it's more basic. And then there's a media tab where I've done other kinds of interviews and did a conversation series with a spiritual teacher, various kinds of things. And yeah, you can browse the site. My coaching services are there too.
I would highly recommend that. There's an incredible wealth of knowledge on that website. So, David, thank you again for session 2. I'm sure we could make a dozen of these, but I appreciate your time again, and I'll get these all edited up. And as soon as they are dropped on YouTube, I will let you know.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, David. See ya.